There. Welcome back to Strategic Management. We are now into week 3, and I hope that you're finding your stride and some sort of rhythm to the class. It will be a little bit easier once we finish our practice rounds in the business strategy game and move towards the regular weekly closings and discussion forums happening regularly, so that then it really is a little bit more structured. So hope you're doing well, and I wanted to introduce a couple concepts for you today that you'll be reading about, and also should be helpful for your business strategy game. So one of the things we do in determining our strategy, we know that we look both internally and externally, and most of you have heard of a SWOT analysis, which deals with the internal aspects of strengths and weaknesses of your organization, but also the external environment, and there we're looking at opportunities that the environment has created that we could take advantage of, or threats. So in evaluating the external environment, one tool that we use is called a PESTLE analysis, and each letter of the word PESTLE is the beginning of each of the elements that are listed below it. So we look at political factors, what's going on in the world. Certainly right now with COVID-19, there are a lot of changes, and we're listening to politicians and our government officials. Economic conditions certainly have changed drastically in the last several weeks. And then we have socio-cultural forces, trends, interests that people have. Certainly in terms things like demographic changes, an aging workforce, aging consumers, but then the growth of the millennial generation, and then just various attitudes. So we may end up seeing a shift in how people congregate and spend their leisure time after this. Certainly after this situation we have here with coronavirus. Technology is changing constantly, and this affects everything in terms of our environment. And then we also have the actual environment itself and factors like sustainability. Of course, we have legal and regulatory factors. My last industry was healthcare, and it is one of the most highly regulated industries, and for good reason. You're dealing with people's health and lives. Before that, I was in banking, which is another highly regulated industry. So all of these affect our ability to do business and to thrive, and we need to think about these when we create our strategy. There's a somewhat recent new idea that was proposed by a couple of authors, and it's called Blue Ocean Strategy. And what this talks about is the fact that if you really want to have a sustainable competitive advantage, that you need to look for, first of all, 3 things. What your product or service or idea, it needs to be valuable. It's something that's valued by your consumer base or market. It needs to be unique or rare, something that is unusual, is new and different, that will catch people's attention. And it needs to be difficult to imitate, because if it's easy to imitate, then it's not a sustainable advantage, and within a matter of weeks or months, your competitors will have it. And then you've spent a lot of money creating something that others are taking advantage of as well. So we look at Michael Porter's 5 forces, which we'll talk about here in a minute, that could lead to a sustainable competitive advantage. And also the concept of whether or not first mover advantage is really an advantage. So in Blue Ocean Strategy, the authors, Ken and Milborn, posited that you can create a new market space and make your competition irrelevant. So the way that's done is, you see here we have a picture of a red ocean on the left and a blue ocean on the right. In the red ocean, the reason it's red is you have all these competitors fighting for the same in the same marketplace, and they're getting bloodied by each other. If instead of continuing to fight there, then what if you came up with an idea that created an entirely new market space, and then you jump over to what we call a blue ocean strategy where you are it. So let's think about examples. So a long time ago, we used to have these things called CDs, and when Napster came along and you could download music, it was very threatening to the music industry, and they tried to block it. And there were many years of legal battles between Napster and various music artists and companies, and they were fighting in this red ocean to determine, you know, who got what was available there, right, in terms of the market. In the meantime, a little company called Apple, led by Steve Jobs at the time, decided, well, maybe there is a sweet spot at which people will pay to download music as long as it's reasonable, and then they have it. And so they created this thing called iTunes. And then, in order to take it a step further, they developed a product that was proprietary along with iTunes, and it was called an iPod. And it changed the industry entirely. So people abandoned this idea of free downloads and moved over. They got tired of the fight and tired of the CDs. And so the losers were the original companies who were fighting and getting bloodied in the red ocean. And Apple jumped over and created a new blue ocean based on its technology, its innovation, and foresight. So that is the blue ocean strategy. So while you are considering your strategy and implementation of your strategy in the business strategy game, I'd like you to think about Porter's 5 strategic approaches, which we'll expand on here in just a sec, and then identify what strategy fits best for your company. So look at all of the 5 forces and consider whether or not which ones are at play, which ones are the most important, which ones are creating difficulties, which ones are creating opportunities. So that alongside that, then try to identify the strategies of your competitors in the simulation. And one of the best places I go to look at that is one of the reports called the Competitive Intelligence Report. And that will give you an idea of how each company in your industry is positioning themselves. So take a look at that. The 5 forces framework, basically it's about how an industry is structured and how attractive it is for new entrants. So if I want to create a product and a new company, and I have to look at the industry that already exists to see if it is possible to actually do well with this new company and new product line. So as you can see here, the competition inside the industry is very, very important. If it's already really keen, then and there are some big, powerful players, that makes it a huge barrier to entry. And a barrier to entry are things that maybe an industry requires a great deal of capital. Or, for instance, in healthcare, you can't just hang out a shingle outside of office and start seeing patients as a physician. You have to be licensed. In order to be licensed, you have to have certain degrees and pass certain tests. It's a huge barrier to entry, right? Regulations and legal aspects can be barriers to entry. Forms that you have to fill out, how long it takes to get through a process to start a business. Substitute products are really interesting. So let's say you have this great product line, but it's not so unique that, for instance, you don't have a lot of ability to capture an audience well, because maybe there are other products that can be substituted for the one that you're providing that are less expensive or more accessible. So when we think about substitute products, think about, okay, so I purchase coffee because I'm either looking for taste, uh, probably not quenching thirst, but maybe, and possibly looking for a caffeine boost. So if I'm looking for a caffeine boost, where else could I look? I could possibly substitute tea or maybe some other caffeine-laden drink, right? So that would be a substitute product, just like Kleenex and toilet paper can be substitutes for each other. Then the last two have to do with the bargaining power of either the buyer or the supplier. So that has to do with the availability of your product, how many people are providing it, etc. So if there is very little demand for your product and a lot of buyers, then those buyers have quite a bit of bargaining power because you need them, right? If also, like for instance, with the bargaining power of suppliers, let's say there are only one or two suppliers who supply parts in your industry, then because there are so few of them, they have strong bargaining power, which means that they can determine pricing and terms of delivery, etc. So those are all important things that we look at in terms of entering an industry or thriving in an industry. And so you want to think about that as you develop your strategy. Here's a graph or picture of the 5 forces and how they can influence. You see in the middle is the rivalry or the industry competition. This really is the most important of all. And then you have potential entrants, people trying to come in. So then, you're looking at the factors that are closest to it. You have suppliers and buyers coming in, and then you have substitutes, and all of them are applying pressure on the industry. So the rivalry, as I mentioned, among competing firms is the most powerful of all 5 forces. This is one of the things that we focus on the most in the simulation game. And so determining a strong strategy for your company and following it is critical, as is determining as best you can what the competitive strategies are of your competition. And if we look at entry of new competitors, which is not part of the simulation, but it would be of the real world, barriers to entry are really important. Things like quality, pricing, and marketing can overcome barriers, but let's take a look at some of the barriers to entry. So for instance, if it's a type of industry where economies of scale are really important, you need to ramp up to that really fast because of the cost involved in order not to suffer. And gaining technology and know-how in some industries can be very overwhelming. Experience, is this a new area where it's hard to find quality folks to fill the positions that you need, right? If there's strong customer loyalty to other companies, that's a difficult one to overcome. And we see that in the soft drink industry between Coke and Pepsi. So Coca-Cola and Pepsi each have approximately 49% of the marketplace. And you see a lot of strong customer loyalty to both those brands. If you wanted to break in as a third party, that would be extremely difficult. And some people are really, really tied to certain brands. They are loyal. They will stick with the brand even if there's been a problem with it. They will give them second chances. And a strong brand can build a very strong market following, which means a large market share. I mentioned large capital requirements to join an industry, and this can be, very difficult, particularly in times of a slower economy or in times of really high interest rates. And then you also need to look at your distribution channels and make sure that they're available to you and that they're willing to take on a new player in the market. Other barrier to entries are some of the things I mentioned, like governments and regulations. We certainly have heard a lot of talk in the last year or so about tariffs. Getting raw materials. If you need access to patents, you're going to have to pay for that unless you own them in-house. Locations, all kinds of things. And then the last, next to last one, counterattack by entrenched firms. Don't just assume that if you're moving into a competitive space, that those competitors are just going to let that happen. They're going to fight tooth and nail to hang on to their market share and do everything they can to actually grow it. So, and we do need to look out for a saturation of market. That's when you have too many players. For a while, we had a saturation in the airline industry, and just recently we saw some consolidation where they were merging or purchasing one another. And now, of course, it's a completely different ballgame. We'll have to wait and see what happens after COVID-19. I mentioned substitute products. The pressures increase if the prices of the substitutes decrease, making them more attractive, right? And a lot has to do with switching costs. So if you think about your cell phone, let's say you're either an Android or an Apple user. You tend to buy other products and services that are very compatible with that, and switching from one to the other at some point has some cost, a lot in terms of time and energy, etc., learning curve. And then bargaining power of suppliers, which we mentioned, really dependent on the number of suppliers, right? And how many substitutes there are, and the cost of switching to different materials, etc. So all of these have some really interesting and important aspects to them. Consumers, buyers, really can have a lot of bargaining power. It really depends on, a lot has to do with supply and demand. So ways in which, conditions in which consumers often gain bargaining power, as if it's, switching is not a big deal from one product to another, one company to another. And if the demand, I mentioned supply and demand on the other end, it's very apparent here as well. And a lot can depend on whether or not the consumers actually understand what your product has to offer. So they may be uninformed and therefore choose a particular model because they know it, right? And they may demand the qualities or aspects of that particular product. So that is